So as we continue to examine what the eyes can tell us about what we're feeling and thinking, I want you to go back to that model we've been talking about before, comfort and discomfort. When we're comfortable, the eyes are relaxed. When we're comfortable, the eyes look untroubled. There is no squinting. They communicate the softness, the gentility that is going on in the mind. And this is perhaps why, over the ages, people have said that the eyes are windows to the soul. Because when we are truly in love, when we are truly cared for, when we are truly comfortable, our eyes have the means of transferring that information in the same way that they transfer the information when we're troubled. We've all seen the person who is crying, who is grieving, who is suffering. And so we see the tears, we see the red eyes, we see the nervous tension of the eyes and so forth. And these things we cannot dismiss. They reveal so much to us in a very short period of time. And when it comes to emotions, many times our bodies will be a cipher to us, but the eyes will reveal in very small measure that which is really emotionally felt. I'll never forget almost 25 years ago where in Puerto Rico, where I was assigned, one of our FBI agents lost his wife to a horrible accident. Now here's a room full of really very strong men and women who are used to being shot at, who are used to dealing with very tough individuals, dealing with very serious matters. And I remember standing in that room, and we were ramrod straight. Our shoulders were wide, and yet our eyes could not contain that which we felt. It was in those eyes. We had mastered everything else. We had mastered the ability to look strong, and yet our eyes were revealing the pain that we were all feeling at the loss of this wonderful woman. And as we look at the human form, this is a reminder that oftentimes we may not see the things that we might think might be there, but in one particular moment, there in a room full of very stout individuals, the one thing that could not be concealed was the emotions being betrayed by the eyes. And we see this with children. We see it with workers. I've seen it with workers who are sitting in a cubicle and they've received terrible news. And their hands are moving on the keyboard, but their eyes are revealing the emotion of the moment. And once again, this is a behavior that we must not overlook. The beauty of the eyes in revealing emotions is often felt when we first meet someone. Imagine meeting someone and as you go to shake their hand, their eyes are just fixed. And then you meet another person and as you go to shake their hand, they look at you and they arch their eyebrows in what's known as the eyebrow flash. This simple act can transform a relationship. This simple act, the arching of the eyebrows, this quick eyebrow flash, which takes a tenth of a second, can transform a relationship, can make people feel extremely comfortable. This is so powerful, and I mean this in its truest sense. This is so powerful that when young babies see eyebrow flash, they immediately relax. It lowers their blood pressure, and it permits bonding between the person, usually the mother or the father who does the eyebrow flash, and the child. In corporate America, in the business world, relationships can be more quickly established by using an eyebrow flash to welcome someone into your organization, to greet someone. Doctors who, upon first meeting a patient, using the eyebrow flash, can establish more empathetic channels of communication. And in fact, we've done studies where when we asked the patients how they felt about their doctor, when their doctors used this very simple technique of the eyebrow flash, they felt that they were very comfortable with this individual, even though they had just barely met them. So here's a powerful behavior. It's often overlooked. In some ways, it's as powerful or maybe even more powerful than a smile, to let someone know that you're interested in them, that you're excited about them. And why is that? Because when we arch our eyebrows, we're defying gravity. And as I've stated earlier, one of the ways that we show excitement, one of the ways that we show true emotion is by defying gravity. And by arching our eyebrows and flashing our eyes very quickly, we're saying, I feel really positive about you. So here's one that if it's not part of your daily routine, you can incorporate this in your life. And so when a child comes home to you and says, Dad, look what I did today, we can reward that child non-verbally with an eyebrow flash, showing our excitement. When we meet someone for the first time, we can arch our eyebrows and say, what a pleasure it is to meet you. And we overwhelm these individuals with this positive sentiment that is extremely powerful and that's spoken with the body and not with words. As we consider nonverbals of the eyes, I also want to remind you that we have an orientation reflex for movement. And what that means is that we tend to immediately and subconsciously move our eyes in the direction of anything that moves. And quite often you'll be talking to someone and someone or something moves by us and we find we can't control our eye movement. We have to sort of track that. And the reason for that is because we're designed to protect ourselves, and any movement, any sudden movement can startle us. We are designed to constantly assess for those things. So we're primed for looking for movement, but we're also conditioned by social practices, or what we call social conventions. Now, in the United States, we are actually allowed to look at each other for just over a second. Anything beyond that is suggestive of predation, and we've all had someone who has stared at us for too long. Certainly women feel this. There's nothing worse, I think, for a woman than to be walking down the hallway or down a street and be ogled at. And so we have social conventions as to what we're allowed to look at and for how long. For instance, in the Middle East, you would not stare at a woman. First of all, she's not your daughter or your sister, and therefore you're really not entitled to be as inquisitive in your look as, say, if you were in Latin America. And I remember being in Brazil and being told by Brazilian women that they can tell when an American is looking at them because they look ever so briefly and then they look away. And so I said, well, what's the difference with Brazilian men? And they said, well, they'll look at you, but they'll look at you a little longer because that's acceptable here. And you certainly see that also in the Middle East, where men will look at men for 2 or 3 seconds at a time. And that's socially acceptable. So we have our innate needs to look at each other to assess for danger, but then we have our social restrictions which say, for instance, in an elevator where you're in close proximity, you really shouldn't be looking at each other too much. Well, that's very American. And you certainly see it in elevators. When I used to work in New York City, you come into the elevator, you almost, for whatever the reason, avoid eye contact, and immediately you place your hands in front of you and you're looking at the numbers. That's not how the rest of the world works. And in fact, in many countries, that's extremely rude. And I've been to many countries, particularly in Central and South America, where once you enter the elevator, it's expected that you make eye contact with everybody else there and you turn inward. Everybody faces each other rather than face away to the door or the numbers. So eye gaze behavior, the amount of time we use to look at someone, where we look on that person, is governed by society. And most research tells us that in the United States, in Western societies, we are really allowed only to look at the area between the eyes and the chin. The eyes and the chin. And we'll scan that area. But anything that goes below that, especially towards the neck, is considered personal. And if your loiter time is inordinate, beyond the eyes and the chin, and it goes down to the neck and to the breast area, that's considered intrusive. So I mention this because this is something that we often neglect to tell people who are traveling abroad for the first time, or even our children who may be going off to college, and we have to remind them that what we've learned to do here is not necessarily what's practiced in other cultures, and that the use of gaze behavior can be very threatening or it can be very intrusive. And to make people comfortable, we want to mirror that behavior with which they're most familiar. Which brings me to a few other things regarding eye gaze behavior. Many children in America, especially African American children, are taught to avert their eyes when their parents are castigating them, when they're being punished, or when they're talking to authority. And I remember years ago reading books talking about that if you look away when you're talking, that you're lying. Well, I'm here to tell you that's also bogus. Eye aversion has more to do with social regulation than whether or not we are telling the truth or lying. Vietnamese children, children from the Middle East, and as I said, African American children, even Latin American children are often taught that in the face of an authoritarian figure, that they are to look down or to look away, because to stare directly at the person in authority is disrespectful. So be mindful of that. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is watch yourself when you talk to friends. I find myself that when I'm truly relaxed around people I care about and I'm comfortable with, that I tend to look away. I can so relax, my limbic brain can stand down, and I can afford to look away as I envision things and I talk about things. It has nothing to do with deception, it has nothing to do with truth or lying, it has to do with relaxation. So those myths that are out there about looking away and not making eye contact, that's all they are. Is it true that some people who lie look away? Yes, that is true. But it's also true that people who are telling the truth will also look away because that's how they prefer to process information as they talk to you. There's one other feature of the eyes which I think are significant when we're studying nonverbal behaviors. And if you remember earlier, I talked about the connection between the forehead and the neck because all these muscles and nerves are interrelated. Well, now I'm going to connect one that maybe you've never thought about, and that's the connection between the eyes and the mouth. And it has to do with a true smile versus a false smile. And one of the things that researchers have found, and Paul Ekman, who has done a lot of research on nonverbal behavior, has found, and that is that when we have a true, sincere smile, the muscles around the eyes are engaged in that process. And when we have a false smile, a public smile, a social smile, perhaps one where we don't really mean it, but we're doing it because society requires it, the eyes are not engaged. And so a true smile, the corners of the mouth come up towards the eyes, and the eyes will reflect that because the muscles of the eyes will be involved in that smile, and this is where we get the crow's feet effect. The false smile, the social smile, this is the smile that moves the corners of the mouth towards the ears, but does not involve the eyes. And this is one of the ways that we assess for genuine emotions. When someone greets us or we're dealing with someone and they smile at us and we're trying to determine whether or not they really mean what they're saying. And we quickly learn that that true smile involves the eyes, and the false smile, there is no eye involvement. Well, thus far we've learned quite a bit about the face, but there's a lot more. We've talked about the forehead, we've talked about the eyes. Now I'd like to take a minute and just talk about the nose. And the fact of the matter is that the nose can actually give us quite a bit of information. Now obviously there are many kinds of noses. There's long noses and short noses and wide noses and narrow noses and so forth. But in all cases, there are things about the nose which can reveal information to us. And the first one is that when we are stressed, our nose tends to get very dry, and the hairs inside the nose become much more sensitive because now the mucous membranes have dried up, and so these little hairs that are inside are more sensitive to wind, and they're more sensitive to our breath. So we tend to see a lot more nose touching. We tend to see a lot more nose massaging when we're under stress, in part because of the dryness, and in part because the nose is an area which is rich with nerves. And in touching the nose, this helps to pacify us. Now, I remember when I first went to the Utah Police Academy in 1975, and I remember a lecturer there saying, well, if a suspect touches his nose, then he's definitely lying. Well, I can definitively tell you that what I was told 30-something years ago is junk. For in fact, the touching of the nose has nothing to do with telling the truth or deception, because both the honest and the dishonest will touch their nose. The fact of the matter is that we often touch our nose as a means of pacifying. And so we have to put it in context. We touch our noses because we're in line and it's taking too long to get through the line. We touch our nose because we remembered that we left something at home. We touch our nose because we're doing an exam and we can't remember the numbers that we need. Or we touch our nose because we're driving and we're absolutely bored stiff, and this is creating some sort of stimulus for us. So I know that some of you have learned, read, or heard that if you touch the nose while you're talking, that you're definitely lying. There's just absolutely no science behind that. And I have to tell you, as an investigator and someone who has literally done thousands of interviews, it has nothing to do with deception, because both the honest and the dishonest will, in fact, touch the nose. Now, there's something else about the nose that's kind of interesting, and it has to do with the wings of the nose. And one of the interesting things that happens to us is when we get excited about something, when we're going to do something physical, the wings of our nose tend to dilate. And the reason that they dilate is we're going to do something physical. And our brain says, hey, take in more oxygen. And in doing so, the narrow wings dilate, and this is in preparation for some physical activity. Now, I'm going to share this with you, even though it may not affect most of you. Yes, we do see narrow wing dilation and fluttering when people are upset and they're mad and so forth. But as an investigator, we also used to see it with individuals who we stop on the street and we begin to ask them questions. And we look for this behavior as a sign that this person is either going to run or may physically attack us. Now, this isn't a course on self-protection, but it's something to keep in mind, that as we look at the face, we shouldn't ignore the nose, because this is something that is in front of us, and may reveal information to us. And obviously, any one of us can be confronted on the street by an individual, and we often see this with purse snatchings, where the person comes up, asks the questions, and in going back and in talking to victims, they say, well, I noticed that there was something wrong. Their feet were not pointed towards me, they were pointing away in the way they would eventually run, and I noticed that their noses were flaring. In other words, they were preparing for the eventual run, and they were telegraphing their thoughts and intentions, and it showed through the nose. So now we are finally at the midway point on the face, and we can talk about the mouth. As most of us know, Freud devoted an unusual amount of attention to the mouth because he felt that all of us had our oral stage. And in fact, we do. Where I differ from Freud is that he saw it as a stage. And I think for those of us who study nonverbal communications, the mouth is something that is not a stage. This isn't something that we go through. And yes, it's true, when we're children, we explore the world by putting things in our mouth. I saw a child the other day at the doctor's office pick up a magazine and stick the magazine in his mouth. And I kept thinking, how many people have touched that magazine? Children don't care. This is how they perceive the world, with their eyes and with their mouth. And for most of us, as we grow up, our mouths are still how we explore the world. This is how we explore new foods, new drinks, new tastes. This is how we taste the person we love, our lovers, and so forth. This is how we examine new textures. So really, our oral phase never really leaves us. It is always with us, and it serves many purposes. Our mouths are rich with nerves that tell us how things taste, the temperature of things. I remember my mother, when I was a child, would put her lips on my forehead, and she could tell within a degree or two whether or not I had a fever or I had a high fever. Our mouths are extremely sensitive, and our mouths are extremely expressive. When we look at the thousands of languages that exist, and we see that we express language through the movement of our lips and our vocal cords. What I want to do now is share some things with you about the mouth that is not readily apparent, but is in fact significant. Think of how many times you've licked your lips. You may do this hundreds of times in a day. If you live in a dry environment, you may do it actually hundreds and hundreds of times per day. But the reason we lick our lips is because on the surface of our lips are an extraordinary amount of nerve endings. And by licking our lips, we are in fact pacifying ourselves. We often think that the baby pacifies because the tongue can suckle. Well, that's part of it. In fact, that's why many of us take comfort in chewing gum or eating. But what we often mistake is the part that the lips have in this process. And the fact of the matter is that when we see people licking their lip, touching their lips, stroking their lips, rubbing pencils and the stems of their reading glasses on their lips, smoking pipes, strumming their fingers on their lips, pulling in various directions, what we are in effect doing is pacifying. We are inducing our limbic system to release these opioid-type chemicals that are soothing and pleasing to the body. When you look at the mouth, I want you to think of it as here is a place that not only does speech come out, but it's a good place to see where emotions are felt. And I've seen the vibrating lips of the person who has just been traumatized. And I've seen the disappearance of blood, the graying and the bluing of the lips from someone who is suffering from shock. As blood is taken from the surfaces of the body and it's descended to the interior, and you can see it in the lips. So for those of us who observe human behavior, the lips communicate things that the person may not be able to communicate. The lips also transmit information which may be at variance with what is being said. And you often see this with people testifying before Congress. They've raised their hand, they've sworn to tell the truth. They begin to tell the story, and then they get to a particular section where they're asked questions, and all of a sudden, their lips are gone. Their lips tighten and literally disappear. And as you look at these photographs, and you say, where did the lips go? Why did the lips disappear? The lips disappeared because of the high degree of stress that the person is undergoing. It has nothing to do with deception. It has nothing to do with truth or lying. It has to do with the fact that in real time, our limbic system kicks in and says, if something is really troubling you, if something is really bothering you, if something is really disconcerting, I will make your lips small. I will tighten the muscles in that area. In fact, I will make your lips disappear. And so here's a good indicator of emotions and thoughts, usually negative ones. And I've seen it in board meetings. I've sat in board meetings with companies where a new directive has come out, and those people in that meeting which were in opposition to the new directive, you see them there and you see their lips are gone. Usually it's preceded with a little bit of lip touching, and then as you look at their mouths, you see where have those full lips gone. And I'm telling you, when you see lips that have disappeared, there's a high degree of stress. So anytime you see lips disappear, you can associate that with some sort of stress or discomfort. And this is universal. But there's one behavior which is truly indicative of deep distress, and it shows up in the mouth. Now here's what's interesting, and you may want to do this a little later, or if you are near a mirror, try this now. Go up to the mirror and make your lips disappear. And what you'll find is that when you make your lips disappear, they disappear in a straight line. Now here's what's interesting. When there's deep, deep distress, when there's deep pain and suffering, not only will your lips disappear, but the corners of your mouth will turn downward so that your mouth looks like an upside down U. And if you want a good reminder of this, go back and think of the moment when Eliot Spitzer announced that he was in trouble. And those famous photographs of him where his lips have completely disappeared and the corners of his mouth have descended. And this is one of those great examples of a person who is deeply and emotionally traumatized. We see this with people who have recently lost someone, who are grieving, or who have learned something really tragic that has taken place. And they don't have to tell you. They don't have to vocalize what just happened. You can see it in their face. And when you see that mouth, where the lips have disappeared and it's become like an upside down U, I'm here to tell you that that is true, deep sentimentality. And it's always associated with something negative. So we've talked about the lips and how we use them to pacify. We lick them. We touch them with objects like pencils. We touch them with our mouths and so forth. They disappear when we're under stress, and they turn downward when it's deep emotional stress. But there's other things that are related to the mouth which can reveal to us much about a person's emotions. And they have to do with the tension of the mouth, and especially the muscles that surround the mouth and which radiate outward towards the jaws. The more stress we have, the angrier we are, the greater the tension in the face, the greater the tension in the mouth. And that's why you see sometimes people, when they're angry, are talking with a very tight jaw, very small mouth. You can just barely see their teeth. And this is because of this tremendous tension that exists there. And obviously, this is something that we need to assess for. One of the things that I always find remarkable as I work with attorneys is that when I look at affidavits or when I look at depositions and I see the written word and then I view it on video or I'm present to actually witness it, and you realize how little words convey in relation to what we see. And oftentimes it's these facial gestures that reveal so much. Associated with the mouth is something that Paul Ekman and others have looked at, and these are often referred to as micro gestures or micro expressions. Now, it is true that Dr. Ekman found these using high-speed cameras, and they are present with all of us. But I think if we are sensitive to these little micro expressions, the little short half smile, or the slight look of contempt, which is usually demonstrated through the face, we can derive a lot of information from that. In fact, one of the things that we find, and researchers have carefully looked into, is this: that there are a variety of ways that we can show contempt with our face, by using a sneer, by looking askance, and most of us can picture this look. The research in this area is fascinating. What scientists have found is that when there's couples in therapy and one or the other sneers or looks in contempt at his partner, there's likely to be a 70% chance of divorce within the next 3 years. That's an extraordinary observation, but it's really truly reflective of what is going inside the mind. That when we begin to show contempt and disregard with our faces, what we are in essence saying is, I have little regard for you, and the obvious chances of success are minimized. So we look to the mouth to tell us about stress, but we can also look to the mouth to tell us about happiness and joy. When the lips are full, when the lips are relaxed, when the lips are warm, when blood flows into that area, the limbic brain is in fact saying, things are good. There is comfort here. And because there's comfort, I'm going to allow this area to relax and to become rich with blood. But now comes something that's a little bit more subtle. Someone comes to you and says, you know what, rather than going to the Chinese restaurant, why don't we go to the Italian restaurant? And suddenly you find yourself pursing your lips. You find yourself pursing your lips as you're contemplating that. And the question is, well, what does that mean? Your lips aren't disappearing, your lips aren't full, but you're pursing your lips. Well, here's what the research tells us. Lip pursing is associated with 3 things. Primarily, it's that we are in disagreement with something. So someone says something to us, and we disagree with that completely, and we are pursing the lips. We may be nodding our head, acknowledging that we're receiving the information, but the lip pursing, pretty conclusive that we're in disagreement. Number 2, it's also associated with thinking of something alternatively. Someone suggested Chinese, the other person suggested Italian. I'm pursing my lips. I'm thinking Thai. I think I want to eat Thai food today. And my pursed lips reflect that. And lastly, you sometimes see people as they're concentrating, as they're working with numbers or doing something definitive, finite, precise, there'll be some lip pursing. But essentially, lip pursing is associated with something that is alternative. I often see this in court where attorneys at sidebar are making these great arguments before the judge, and the judge is sitting there nodding his head and pursing his lips. And I can tell you right now, I know that attorneys are trying to enter the material into the record, but I know the judge is going to disagree with them. How do I know this? Because he's pursing his lips. He may be nodding his head. All that means is I'm accepting the information. But he's already made his decision, and he's in disagreement with the attorneys. Years ago, I was hired to work with a negotiating team. And one of the things that we looked for as the negotiators would read the contracts was to observe the behaviors of the opposing negotiators and to note when they were in disagreement with something. And it was actually quite easy for me to do, and not because of any specialized training, not because of any unique quality that I have that you can't have. It's because I knew that when we purse our lips, we're in disagreement with something. And as they read each and every sentence out loud in this contract, I could see when the opposing negotiators liked something and when they were thinking that perhaps this needed to be rewritten or they were disagreeing with it. And this is something that you can do. Now, this is also something that comes into play on a day-to-day basis. You walk into your manager or your boss and you say, "What do you think about doing this or that?" And they sit there and they're pursing their lips. What a great opportunity for you to take a step back and say, "Well, that's just my idea on this. What do you think we should do?" And how do I know that they have an idea? Because of the lip pursing. They're pursing their lips and they're communicating, "I'm thinking something alternatively." One of the other things we sometimes see with the mouth that is difficult to decipher, and that is individuals who pacify by rubbing the insides of their mouth with their tongue. They may stroke the insides of their mouths. They may even bite the insides of their mouth when they're under stress. And just be aware that some people like to pacify externally, but there's others that will actually do it internally using the tongue. Some people will actually masticate, which is a form of chewing. It's a false chewing where it looks like they're chewing something, but they're just moving their mouths because all of this generates pacifying feelings. These are soothing feelings. And of course, some people chew gum, some people chew tobacco, and so forth. And this has its own pacifying effect. As we talk about the mouth, one of the things that I found quite by accident was one day I had arrested this young man, and I found that here it is, the middle of the day, and he was yawning, and yawning excessively. And I went back and looked at some of the arrests that I had made in years previous, and I noticed that oftentimes when people were arrested, there was an excessive amount of yawning. And in consulting physiologists and other practitioners of the science of nonverbal communication, one of the things that jumped out as a possibility to explain this is this. When we're under stress, our mouths become very dry. And one of the things that we do to force our mouths to regain moisture is we yawn. And by yawning, we force the parotid glands, the salivary glands, to release saliva. And so I tell people that if you're a teacher and you see a lot of students are all of a sudden yawning excessively, or if you're a police officer and you've arrested someone and you notice that under interrogation they are yawning excessively, that it's not always because they're sleepy, that more likely than not, this is a pacifier. Their mouths are dry, they're under stress, and by yawning over and over, they're forcing pressure on these glands in the mouth, which then release moisture into the mouth and, of course, have a pacifying effect. One of my favorite pacifiers, and I know for a fact it's one of your favorite pacifiers, it's because we see it around the world, and it has to do with exhaling. You ever notice when you almost bump into something or you almost run into the car in front of you, you find yourself afterwards going, you're exhaling air through puffed cheeks. Well, exhaling through puffed cheeks is one of the ways that we pacify. It's our way of calming us down after an eventful circumstance, and we often see it. We often see it with very young children when all of a sudden they throw a brick and it almost hits a window, and they may be 3 years old, but you see them going in the same way that the other day as I was driving up to a toll booth, I almost hit the car in front of me when my foot slipped, and I did the very same thing. I exhaled with puffed cheeks. It's a very accurate indicator that something stressful just took place, and we're now relieved. Where else do we see it? We see it in contract negotiations, where at the end of the day, the final document is signed, and one of the parties at the end of it all does that same behavior. And you realize, aha, they were really stressed over it, and now they're relieved. So we've looked at the forehead, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and we've looked at the muscles of the face. And we know that tension is usually shown in this vast area, this vast canvas. But we also need to look at things that the face also revealed to us in the form of our chins. What does the chin really reveal about us? Well, you see oftentimes the chin in conjunction with the hand. We've seen the photographs and the drawings of the thinker where the chin is resting on the hand. We've seen people stroking their chin, touching their chin, and so forth. Well, I'm here to parse this for you. Usually, chin touching is associated with pensiveness, with thinking, with thought, with precision of ideas. But that is to be differentiated from people who touch their face, especially around the jawline, because we tend to pacify ourselves by touching our jaws, and then we tend to show we're thinking about something by touching this little very narrow area, it's about 2 inches wide, of our chin. Now, men do it more than women, but this is something that we do, and we do it around the world. So when you see someone, they're walking, they're sitting, they're touching their chin, it's not so much pacifying as they're thinking. They're touching their jaw, that's more of pacifying. And here's something else that the jaw tells us. When we're strong and we're confident, our jaw comes out. When we are weak and insecure, and when we lack confidence, we tuck our chin in. And that's why sometimes you see people testifying, and their jaw is out, and they're talking about this and that, and this and that, and then they get to something that is really troublesome for them, and they tuck that chin in. They make their statement, and then that chin comes right back out. Now, we can never really know the truth about something unless we were there. But there's one thing we can say, that when that chin disappears, when it begins to be tucked in, the person is lacking confidence. That person is lacking true sentimentality. Their limbic brain is not supporting what they are saying. Because if it did, it would say, it's okay for you to stick that chin out. But the minute we think something, or the minute that we are threatened by something, we tend to tuck that chin in because it demonstrates that we are insecure. So we've looked at the face, we've broken it down as experts tend to break the face down. And now hopefully you realize just how much information is out there and how much the face can reveal to us. Now, I don't have to teach you to look for things like, well, I look bored, or I wish I were somewhere else, or I've had it with you. These facial demonstrations are easy to picture, and we've all demonstrated these things. For in fact, depending on which scientist you listen to, our faces are capable of in excess of 5,000 different expressions. And the reason for that is the huge variety of muscles that we have and interplay. So we're capable of transmitting a lot of information. Some of it is social. For instance, if you live in a country where the mouth is used in certain ways to pronounce words, you will begin to reflect that in how you hold your mouth and so forth. And in particular, I'm thinking of French speakers. And there are things which are not social, but rather universal. So when we look at things such as anger, sadness, surprise, happiness, fear, disgust, the scientific research is straight on this. These are universal, and these can readily be seen in the face. Some other things that can be seen in the face are in some ways tragic. I'm always reminded of Abraham Lincoln, who, for many people, had a very interesting face. And he said this: after age 30, we have the faces we deserve. And certainly those of us who have lived long enough, who have seen children grow up in war zones, or who have seen people who have lived through the effects of great trauma, great personal trauma, or even individuals who have had a lifetime of alcohol abuse or drug abuse, quite often you see on their faces the full extent of their lives are somehow carved into their faces. And this is something that we must also assess for, because there are people who have suffered greatly, who through their own behavior have changed the way they look, altered their facial features, and their faces become a sort of portrait of the pain and suffering in their lives. And at the same time, the face can reveal happiness and love and caring and very positive things. One of the interesting things that you often hear people say is that individuals, husband and wife, begin to look like each other. And the phenomena behind this is that we begin to mirror each other because we take so much comfort in each other that our faces begin to mirror the expressions that we find attractive. We mirror the smile, we mirror the gentility of the face. And by mirroring these behaviors, our muscles begin to adapt. And so we begin to look like each other, if only because the muscles and emotions respond in a similar way. And so you see this synchrony of facial expression. A lot of times I've had people come up to me, especially men, and they say, my wife, she reads me like a book. She'll ask me a question and she'll know when I'm changing the facts or lying or I've neglected to do something. How do they do that? Well, it's not so much that it's their wives. It just happens to be that that's the person that's at home and spends most of the time with them. I'm sure it works both ways. It has to do with the subtle changes that we see. Changes in posture, changes in face. It may be something so simple as whether the chin is out or the chin is in. And what's interesting to me as an observer of human behavior is that most of the time, we don't know what our faces look like. We don't know the expression that we're transmitting. We don't know about the furrows. We don't know about the tension. We don't know exactly how we look. But as I said before, all behavior is governed by the brain, and we are constantly transmitting information. There is no such thing as, well, in this instant, I'm not transmitting information. When it comes to nonverbals, we are transmitting at all times. You say, well, what about when I'm asleep? We can tell when you're having a good dream or a bad dream. We can tell when you are having rapid eye movement. We can tell when you are dreaming just from your nonverbals. We can tell whether or not you're too hot or too cold. We can tell whether or not you're going to have a great night or a lousy night. We can tell how you feel about the partner next to you just by looking at the position of your feet when you go to sleep. So there's no such thing as not transmitting information. And I say that because as we look at the face, and hopefully I've opened your eyes to the face and what it can reveal to us, we do have the ability to mask. We absolutely do. And in fact, I often hear this, that this person or that person has a poker face. And that's true. You can have a poker face. You can have a face that you can master your ability to just hide. But there's no such thing as a poker body. You can hide some of the things in your face. But for those of us who are trained, and for those of you who are now privy to this information, what you're going to find is that there's actually very few of us that can hide information. There's very few of us that can be world-class actors where you can absolutely not read what they're saying, because if it's not in the face, it'll be in the hands. If it's not in the hands, it'll be in the feet and the legs. What we feel, what we think, what we intend will show up somewhere in your nonverbal communications.